So in 1855, Herman Melville wrote an otherworldly novella. It was nominally set on a Spanish slave ship in the remote South Pacific, but it really took place in the mind of the master class. Not the slave-owning master class of antebellum America. In Melville's rendition of Amasa Delano, around whom events in the story circulate, Delano is a modernizer. He's a modern man. He's a new man of the American Revolution. He embodies a cheery optimism about the world. He sees himself as opposed to slavery in both practice, in law, and in sensibility. He believes himself an egalitarian. The story is called Benito Cereno, and it was published at a very consequential moment in Melville and the nation's life. As I mentioned, it was 1855. It was a few years after the publication and appearance of Moby Dick, and a few years before the oncoming Civil War, the launch of the Civil War. It was just as a moment that Herman Melville himself broke down physically and emotionally. We think of Moby Dick now as the American novel. But at the time, it was roundly panned. It didn't sell. Critics thought it was, at best, an indication of Melville's irrelevance, or at worst, an indication of his madness and his lunacy. And then, of course, Benito Cereno was coming right before the Civil War, a moment of deep despair, when people of Melville's generation thought that there was no exit from the crisis that the trafficking in human bodies in the South and slavery, chattel slavery, had brought upon the nation, that there would only be really two options. One is to confront slavery head on, and that would lead to the destruction of the nation, this experiment in liberty that was the American Republic, or let slavery be and accept the fact that freedom for some, liberties for some, meant enslavement of others. A very limited notion of freedom. And in a way, Benito Cereno captures that dilemma and that despair like no other piece of work in American literature. As I mentioned, it takes place in the South Pacific. And a good contrast is with Moby Dick, and in terms of form and style. Moby Dick is the sprawling, generous, capacious novel that takes place over a number of different oceans and brings together peoples of all races in a novel that has a catastrophic ending but is joyous in a lot of its prose. Benito Cereno is the exact opposite in form. It's compressed and condensed into one day on one ship, and then into one mind, into Amasa Delano's mind. Nothing much happens in the story. It all takes place largely through Amasa Delano's point of view. Melville tells the story from Amasa Delano's perspective. He boards this slave ship that he comes across. He's in the South Pacific sealing on his ship, and he comes across this distressed vessel that has tattered sails. Its hull is calcified. It's trailing a long garland of seagrass. It looks very haunting and spooky. It's a strange ship. And Delano boards it, and he spends all day on board the ship.
Thank you, Greg. I think your talk is a challenge for us to think more about the current moment and the reverberations of these stories and themes. So even though you've done a lot of that, I want to push you further to bring some of these revelations up to date. The part that strikes me, in part because I'm doing work on the frenzy of extreme resource extraction today, is your extraordinarily powerful descriptions of the sealing industry. And it speaks in such a clarion way to the current moment, where at a time when we realize that the era of cheap energy that built our modern world and the consumer economy is coming to an end. Rather than coming to grips with that and trying to refashion our economies and cultures for a low energy path, we're going after harder, dirtier, more dangerous, more toxic energy. Tar sands, deep sea drilling, mountaintop removal, fracking, and they're the energy, the most powerful industry on earth is coming up with ever new technologies. What can you tell us about the dawn of that kind of insane resource extraction frenzy that might give us a better understanding or a better way of seeing today's around energy, particularly in terms of like how do these systems come to an end, and where are the pressure points for human agency in terms of how we bring this craziness to an end?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes they come to an end with collapse, right? I mean, with just either economic collapse or ecological collapse. In the case of sealing, what's so powerful about the sealing example and being the very first case of resource extraction of the New Republic is that it was both. It was both oversupply, so the bubble bursted, and it could only absorb so many pelts and make so many capes and whatnot, and the seals just disappeared, and you just saw this. I mean, I just related some of the violence, but I think it's from collapse. Sealing was obviously not the first resource extraction in the Americas. The whole project of the Americas was resource extraction, the gold and silver from Potosi, from these great mines, right, which become the world's first monetary standard, monetize the world, and it's built on slave labor. And I don't know when it comes to an end. I mean, in some ways, these are bubbles within a bubble, and I guess we're waiting. And what your wonderful work on is looking at the bigger bubble, how the whole bubble is about to come down, because it's just unsustainable. It's unsustainable.
In this sense, your riff about the empire of necessity, what Melville was trying to say about that maybe, you know, it's a little too easy to say there's a paradox at the heart of the age of reason when, you know, equality was going to be born of, you know, bringing reason to bear on the world. And, you know, you have a sentence like, or a phrase like, all men are created equal, is kind of like a bit of a big problem there,
right,
in the formation of these, you know, foundational statements of rational liberty. But you're saying that it was not just that paradox, but the blindness to it.
I think that
Delano's inability to see the lie at the heart of the system.
Yes, I think that that's ultimately what my argument would be, and what I believe that Melville was getting at, that the problem isn't the paradox, it's the refusal to see it. And it reveals itself in very concrete ways. I know that's a very abstract way of thinking about things, but we could bring it down to the concrete and look at the difference in political cultures between the United States and Latin America.